Hello, welcome back to Chazin-the-Dream. I'm Ethan, host of this little podcast dedicated to speaking with people who are true visionaries in the field of this war, this cultural war on the purpose of business and creating great places to work. And today, I don't know if thrilled is enough. I'm beyond thrilled to share, to invite Bart Houlahan to the program. And just for those of you, the uninitiated, I want to give a little bit of background about Bart, and then we're going to dive right in. So Bart Houlahan is the co-founded B-Lab in 2006. B-Lab is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to using the power of business to solve social and environmental problems. In 2023, Bart joined Irrational Capital as a partner, and Irrational Capital is an investment research firm with a simple hypothesis, that being that companies that treat their people better will actually outperform the stock market. I know, novel concept. So using proprietary data, the company, Irrational Capital, has discovered a new investment factor called the human capital factor that we're going to dive into, that delivers material to help investors outperform in the equity markets. Result, that these new human capital factor investment strategies work to drive corporate behavior change and demonstrating that doing business actually the right way actually pays. Welcome to the program, Bart.
Ethan, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be with you today.
Oh, it's not a competition, but not nearly as much as I am. So, I want to dive right in because I don't have nearly enough time to have selfishly been able to bring you on the program. But you talk about there being a culture war on the purpose of business. And I'd love if you could just take a little bit of time to expand on what exactly that means, what are the sides, and what's at stake?
So that notion of a culture war on the purpose of business, there's been 50 plus years of a regression around what the purpose of business is. Like ultimately, if you go back to the original idea behind providing corporate charters here in the United States, the idea was that a corporate charter would be provided if you were going to return value to society more broadly. And that ultimately, the end objective of business was furthering societal purposes across the country. And beginning, I think it's now probably 56 years ago, back with Milton Friedman, there was a notion that the purpose of business exclusively was maximizing the return to shareholders. And the challenge with that notion is that it flips on its head the whole idea of why business existed to begin with, which was to build a stronger and more ethical as well as beneficial society. And so I have spent the last, 30 some odd years trying to make clear that business can and should be a force for good. And in fact, that's not just the right thing to do, Ethan. It's a better way to do business. And I know I have data to prove it.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that because that seems to be the monumental hurdling point, which is convincing people who may conceptually understand the importance of creating a strong organizational culture, contributing value to society, putting their people first. But at the end of the day, you and I both know the pushback we receive is great concept, but we have to be profitable.
Indeed. And I think the important thing to make sure people understand is this is a way to be not just profitable, but also resilient and build businesses to last. And so I get frustrated by the false dichotomy. The idea that if you take care of your workers, you're engaged in your community, you measure your impact on the environment and try to mitigate those environmental impacts, that in some way is concessionary. It in some way is pulling away value to your shareholders. And after 28 years, there's now clear evidence to the contrary.
Can we spend a little bit of time talking about that clear evidence? And in my thought process when you were kind enough to say you're coming on the program. I didn't think I would dive right in to this notion of the data, the collection of the data. And you talk about 8,500 certified B Corp companies across 150 industries, and you talk about this human capital factor. How do you gather the data? What does it tell us? How do you go through the certification process of a B Corp? Like, just can you share a little inside baseball in the spirit of transparency about what that is?
Yeah, let's back up and make sure we land the plane on what we're talking about, Ethan, because I'm sure many of your listeners don't know what a B Corporation is.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let's go back there because that makes perfect sense.
Let's start there, and then we can talk about why we created that nonprofit, what we were trying to accomplish, and what evidence we were able to generate, and then how that led to Irrational Capital, my new opportunity. And so, Ethan, as you know, and as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I'm an entrepreneur. And way back when, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I actually ran an athletic footwear company, a company called And One Basketball. We competed with Nike and Reebok and Adidas. At our peak, we were the second largest basketball company in the world. And this was started by a bunch of college friends. My roommate from college was one of the founders, and I joined about 6 months in as the president of the organization. And together we scaled this business, and we were trying to build something that we were proud of, Ethan. And for us, that meant putting our people first, right? It meant taking care of our own employees. And when we saw that that was not just the right thing to do, but a better way to do business, we expanded it to our suppliers and our retailers. And we saw over 11 years, time and time again, that putting our people first resulted in actually a more resilient and faster growing and more profitable business. And I have plenty of stories to back that up, but let's just kind of fast forward to the moment of the sale of And One, because it is pivotal for the career thereafter for me.
Right.
At the center of this business was the idea that we're going to put our people first. And let's just say the gentleman who bought the company did not share those values.
But can I just kind of pause to make sure I understand? You talk about putting people first, but I just want to be clear. In my understanding, it's not simply employees, that you created a whole ecosystem of many stakeholders, from your people to your suppliers, vendors, any group of individuals that had a relationship with And One. You worked extremely hard for 12 or however many years.
11, 12 years. That's exactly
11,
right.
12 years to build out this model that was based on ethical treatment of everybody who engaged.
That's exactly right, Ethan. That's exactly right.
Okay,
it wasn't
great.
just
Thank
our
you.
own employees. It was supply chain. It was retailers. And it was a recognition that taking care of our planet indeed also has an impact on people, first and foremost. And so we were absolutely building a business that had these values at the center. The gentleman who bought the company did not share those values. Importantly, Ethan, he paid us fair price.
Right.
But within, I'm going to say 3 to 6 months, he terminated all of our employees. He got rid of a world-class ethical supply chain. He got rid of all of our environmental efforts. He got rid of all of our charitable giving.
All gone.
All gone. The company went from 250 million to 40 million in revenues in 3 years' time. It just collapsed. And looking back on that, it just felt like there had to be a better way. There had to be a way that you could put your people first, scale a company, raise capital, and even have a liquidity event and still hold on to that purpose, hold on to that ethos. And so that was the seed for the idea behind B-Lab, the nonprofit that built the B Corporation movement. And for your listeners who don't know what a B Corporation is, it's a certification like fair trade or organic, or a LEED certification for a building, but with one really critical difference. We look at the whole company. We thought the evolution in the marketplace would be consumers not just supporting a good product or a good supply chain, but instead supporting a good business. And what that meant to us is that we had to evolve the market for certifications and create a certification for a whole company. And so you can think of this, Ethan, kind of like a good housekeeping seal of approval for a business. Now, to certify, you got to do 3 things. You got to take and pass an impact assessment that looks at all of your activities and its impact on all of your stakeholders, your employees, the community, the environment, your workers, and your governance practices. It's a very high bar. And once you take and pass and verify those responses, the next requirement is that you have to rewrite your corporate governing documents so that you embed in the DNA of the business a commitment not just to your shareholders, but to all of your stakeholders, and that you're going to balance as you build this business the interests of your shareholders, who absolutely should get a fair and good return, along with your other stakeholders, the workers and the community and the environment. And then finally, you need to be transparent. You do those three things, you can certify as a B corporation. Ethan, I think the data that you pulled is fresh and still even a little old. We're almost at 10,000 B corporations now.
10,000 B corporations.
In 102 countries. And the companies that people would know would be like the Guardian newspaper, or Dannon Yogurt, or Patagonia. Those types of businesses are our leaders. And the most important thing to know about that leadership play, and the reason we created the certification, going back to our experience at And1, was we weren't just trying to create a new certification. We were trying to move the broader economy more towards a more inclusive, more equitable, more regenerative and sustainable economy. Just nudge the entire economy that way. And so what B Lab fundamentally does is they certify these 10,000 B corporations, but they essentially tell their story to encourage other companies to be more like a B corporation. And Ethan, B Lab works with another 400,000 businesses that are trying to be like a B corporation and use the tools of the nonprofit to be more like those leaders. And so the whole idea is to shift the economy to one that just isn't exclusively focused on maximizing shareholder value, but instead is trying to create value for everyone, for all stakeholders. So that's what the B Corp movement's about. That's how I ended up there from And1. And now I'm happy to talk about the evidence, but you go ahead. You seem like you have a question, please.
No, this is absolutely critically important, because in my excitement to get there, I missed building the foundation of understanding for those who may not have followed the 35-year trajectory, or the, as you said, the 28, but also the 7 in the mid. My interest is, as you're talking about giving this model for companies who get the B Corp certification, that it's not just a very, very lengthy process of altruism, right? There's a hopeful, for them, expected outcome in making this transition to get that B Corp certification. And you talk about, during the pandemic, you talk about this idea of resiliency, that shifting the focus on building out the organization on these human, capital factors, it makes it more resilient. And I'm wondering a little bit about if you haven't kind of like data from, let's say, this number of B Corps were able to remain viable through a global pandemic versus, because I think people are hearing from you that this isn't just a warm, touchy-feely, that is an absolutely systemic way to rethink and restructure your business.
100%, Ethan, you're spot on. And again, zooming out for a second, remembering our end objective. Our end objective is to try to move the economy and just to nudge it towards a more sustainable future, right? And the way that we knew we could do that was first finding inspirational leaders. But these leaders are tip of spear, right? They are companies that are way out in front in terms of putting purpose at the center of their business. And so the reason they would certify is because they wanted to continue to lead. And so imagine these 10,000 B corporations as these super inspirational businesses that are hopefully encouraging other companies to follow their lead. Now, how do you convince those other 400,000 that it's worth following these 10,000 companies? And to us, the whole point was to bring in these 10,000 B corporations and then be able to collect data and tell their story that demonstrated that taking care of all of your stakeholders builds a better business. And so we would collect data, Ethan. We'd have them recertify every 2 to 3 years, and we'd collect data on these businesses. We'd know how they were performing, and then we could publish this data as clear evidence that, folks, this isn't about tree hugging, it's about building a better company. And we early on, Ethan, had very clear data that B corporations retained and attracted more talent. We had
retention, for sure.
Retention. And we had the first place that people use the intellectual property. And so, Ethan, when you become a B Corp, you're given, intellectual property to differentiate yourself. And you can use it on your hang tag or on your container or on your website. It's a bee in a circle. And interestingly, the very first place that people use the intellectual property was on their HR listings.
So here's my question. You've got this portfolio of institutional knowledge, right? That you're saying you've got your patents, trademarks, your copyrights, you put the little bee in the circle and you say, that's the collective brain trust, knowledge base of our organization, which, by the way, if you ever want to exit your business, sell it, merge, this is a way to value the business above and beyond the financials.
That's right. And preserve that particular purpose long term. And so we have this intellectual property. People are using the IP, and the first place they put it was on their HR listings to attract new talent. And so it was a vehicle to bring in talent to an organization. The retention rates went through the roof. Attrition rates collapsed. We saw clear evidence also of stronger consumer connection as they were putting this IP on their Dannon yogurt container, or on the Method Home Products bottle, or on the signs at Tao Ski Resort. Or these are all B corporations, right? But I'll tell you the data point that I got most excited about. And so we're bringing in this data and we're trying to tell the story that this is a better way to do business. And you alluded to this. During COVID, there was obviously an economic shock. That economic shock certainly was the worst in my lifetime, right? We saw small and medium businesses failing across the country at a rate of between 1 in 3 and 1 in 6. Okay. And it depends upon what data set you look at. Some say 1 in 6, some say literally 1 in 3, that a third of our small and medium businesses went out of business during COVID. Our community of certified B corporations had an attrition rate of around 5%. 5%. That is factors better. That is 6 times better than a third. It's an astonishing indicator that if you lean in to managing the impact you have on all of your stakeholders, it will pay for itself many times over. And if you talk to our CEOs, Ethan, and you ask them, how did you survive, that once in a century pandemic? They're going to say it wasn't in spite of our commitment to our employees, community, and the environment. It was because of it. It was because of it. It built stronger relationships. And certainly that was my experience firsthand way back at And One, right? That's what I saw at And One. And the whole idea of B Lab was scaling this idea. Like, let's scale the notion that taking care of all of your stakeholders and putting purpose at the center of the business is a better way to do business. And so that was the evidence set we had at B Lab. You can go on their website and see plenty of other white papers about how revenues grow more rapidly at B corporations than traditional businesses, how they're more resilient, how attrition rates are lower. Those were the evidence sets that we had access to while I was at B Lab.
So you talk about, the narrative arc of your career expanding, 35 years, and you talk about, you mentioned to me an interesting transition for you was from B Lab to Irrational Capital in terms of the focus. So you're talking about the proof positive of companies with the B Corp certification being much more resilient, right? And that this new paradigm shift enables them to survive potentially once in 100-year event. But now you move on to Irrational Capital, you're a partner there. And can you talk a little bit about Irrational Capital and company getting their listing on a happy fund and all that good stuff?
Sure. And so back in 2022, it was time for me to step down as CEO of B-Lab. I was a co-CEO there. I had been running that organization for 17 years. We reached 33 offices around the country, around the globe, with 500 employees. And I'll be honest, Ethan, as an entrepreneur, that's about as far as my founder talents go, right? It was time to find the next generation of leadership to take the organization farther and further. And so we and the other co-founders all stepped down and found exceptional leadership to drive that movement. And it still is accelerating, which is extremely exciting. But I stepped down from there and I spent about a year consulting, Ethan, when I ran into this relatively new, relatively small investment research firm called Irrational Capital. And I was immediately intrigued because they were maintaining that they had found what I considered the Holy Grail. They had found a clear connection between how you treat your people and outperformance in the equity markets. Now, mind you, Ethan, this is not a new idea, right? Like we can go back to
far from it, for sure.
Jim Collins, Peter Drucker, people have been talking about this for 40 years, at least, right? And no one, as far as I know, has been able to independently verified, prove this connection. And they were saying they didn't have just a connection, Ethan. They were saying, we have a new investment factor. We have a new investment factor like momentum or value or growth. And between you and me, it was kind of like BS. Like there's no way you guys have found this, right? And so I start to dive in, and there were two things that were really clear early on. Number one was that this was based upon the social science of a world-renowned behavioral economist, a guy named Dan Ariely out of Duke University. Dan's written a half a dozen books, one of which is called Predictably Irrational, hence the name of the firm, Irrational Capital. He's one of our co-founders. And Dan always believed, and his research bore out, that when we try to measure employee motivation, we measure the wrong things. We measure
what is wrong and what should.
Yeah. No, you're exactly, that's the right question. So
I know you're going there. I'm just trying to keep up.
Yeah. So that, like, think about what we measure. We measure the things that are easy to count. We measure pay scale and benefits and vacation time and bonuses and options. And importantly, those matter, but they drive motivation to a far lesser degree than intrinsic motivators, Ethan. Things like, am I proud to work here? Do I feel connected to the vision, mission, and purpose of the organization?
Right.
Do I feel like there's trust and transparency across the organization? Do I feel recognized for my work? Do I understand how I fit in to driving that vision, mission, and purpose of the business? Those intrinsic motivators, per Dan's data, were far more important to create motivated employees and therefore outperformance. And so first, Irrational Capital was measuring something different. They were measuring these intrinsic motivators. And then secondly, Ethan, they had an amazing database. They had acquired an exclusive database that went back 17 years of employee survey data. And this data had 70,000 companies, 750 million data points. And they took this.
I still can't believe that this data set. It's just mind-boggling, to be honest, when you think about the scope of the data that was gathered to support the contention that greater workplace cultures and more engaged people lead to greater profitability.
And that's what you needed, right? You needed the data set coupled with a new way of counting, and you put them together, and indeed, they found a new investment factor. And what was unique about this investment factor is, if you, like all of the folks who are listening, if you think about all the graphs you see of value growth, and the oscillation of the value growth above and below the benchmark, right? That's what you see over for years and years and years, is this oscillating factor. If you put on the same graph the human capital factor, this new investment factor, it is a flat line, 3 to 6% above the benchmark. It doesn't oscillate. Every year for the last 17 years, every year, it has outperformed the benchmark. It is either generating a higher return in a bull market or losing less in a bear market. It is an absolute outperformance year in, year out. And so when I put those two things together and saw that outperformance, it was clear to me that it was a natural extension of the prior 28 years, Ethan, right? Firsthand at AN1, I was trying to build a culture of putting people first. And I saw firsthand how that generated a more resilient, better, more profitable business that resulted in a sale and what happened after that sale. I then took that idea and went to B-Lab and tried to demonstrate at scale that putting your people first would drive a more resilient business, a better performing business. And now, 28 years later, at this relatively new investment research firm, I had irrefutable, independently verified statistical evidence that companies that treat their people well will outperform the equity market. So much so, Ethan, that we have partnered with JP Morgan, who has validated all this data. They've written 5 research reports on the human capital factor. So importantly, your listeners don't need to believe me. They can go look at JP Morgan's research reports that has found independently a 4% average outperformance year in, year out for the last 14 years. That's how far they went back.
And you have, as a result of the work being done in Irrational Capital, you have organizations based on where they are in their organic life cycle, small, mid, and large cap companies. You have 3 separate funds of organizations who have taken the journey with you or have taken the journey in their shift in mindset.
That's right, Ethan. So having found this new investment factor, the company launched 3 ETFs with their partners at Harbor Capital. And so Harbor is actually the creator and distributor of these 3 ETFs. We form the indexes that underpin these ETFs. There's a large cap, a small cap, and an unconstrained. Okay. And what JP Morgan's data said was that this outperformance was not driven only in a single industry. It was across all industries.
Right.
And then secondly, it didn't matter the size of company. It worked for large cap, mid cap, or small cap. And as a result, we launched these 3 ETFs. And what is crazy to me, Ethan, honestly, I'm still relatively new at the company, is our large cap. It's HAPI is the ticker symbol. You can look it up. It's traded on the New York Stock.
HAPI.
HAPI. Everybody get hopefully happy is indeed, we call it the happy suite. And so HAPI, when you look at a risk-adjusted return, it is in the top 1% when evaluated against 1,400 other ETFs and mutual funds that are benchmarked against the S&P 500. And what is insane to me about that performance is the only thing we use to choose our portfolio is the human capital factor, a rating based upon employee perception of the company. We don't use financial data. We don't do any leadership evaluation. We literally take employee sentiment, reduce it to a single rating that we then rank. We take the S&P 500. We take the top 150, Ethan, who have performed on the human capital factor, and then we industry sector weight and market cap weight. And the reason why we do that is you end up taking all of the risk out of the ETF. It's like you're buying an S&P 500 index. It has a beta of 1. It has 99% correlation. So there is no incremental risk to buying it, but you have all of the outperformance that is generated by these highly motivated employees. And so the fact when I tell people about the actual creation of the portfolio and they learn that this has literally nothing to do with financial data, it is exclusively based upon how employees perceive their business, their company, their employer. It is an entirely novel concept, yet it has no incremental material risk at all because it is industry sector weighted and market cap weighted.
The notion of stripping out all the financial performance information, because that's a lagging indicator, but to say we're going to create this whole structure around what employees are saying. I would like business owners, entrepreneurs, people who are in the process thinking about or down the road doing this, Your people are your closest people to your clients. Your people are the ones who do the work day in and day out. The people are the ones who interact, which creates the informal culture. So what you're doing from a performance perspective, using the human capital factor, is you're literally putting a finger on the pulse of the culture, the soul of the enterprise. And that's exactly what I'm hearing from you. So I mean, I could keep you for another 3 or 4 hours, but I guess my last question for Bart Houlahan is, you've talked about this journey you've been on and where you are now. Where does Bart Houlahan see himself and Irrational Capital moving forward?
It's a great question. And Ethan, I get asked a lot about how I ended up having run B-Lab for 17 years at an investment research company. And I think it's fair. And what has been interesting to me is reflecting on my journey at B-Lab. My journey at B-Lab was trying to attract leaders in the impact space, folks that lead with their values, and then to show to the rest of the world that leading with your values was going to result in a better way to do business, right? If you now move forward to Irrational Capital, I'm now starting with, do you want to outperform in the equity markets? The first people that I'm working with right now, so Ethan, what I'm doing at Irrational Capital is I'm building a rating system where you can rate individual companies on their human capital factor. You can benchmark them against the data set that we have and give them a rating by demographic across what we call the 7 dimensions of the human capital factor, things like organizational effectiveness and emotional connection and innovation. And I can give you a rating on each of those dimensions by gender, by tenure, by geography, by department, giving you a heat map specifically where your corporate culture is misaligned with creating future equity value. And so that's my focus at Irrational Capital, is actually driving a rating system, bringing this idea to individual companies. And if we do it right, Ethan, it should form almost a flywheel, right? As we rate more individual companies, they will be available for capital being deployed in the investment markets around the human capital factor. And as we build brand awareness around the human capital factor, more and more companies are going to be interested in a rating. And so that should drive a flywheel strategy. And at the very center of that, the reason why I'm here is, if we do all that right, it should lead to corporate behavior change. It should lead to everyone embracing the idea of putting your people first. And Ethan, if I zoom again all the way back out and I think about my own journey and my conversations with investors and CEOs over the last 28 years, when I talk about this with investors, there's a skepticism, understandably, because the way they evaluate our performance in the equity markets is based upon financial metrics, price earnings multiples, earnings per share, that is how they think. But I got to tell you, Ethan, when I talk to an individual CEO, this immediately resonates. And the reason why it resonates is, like, you can ask any CEO on the planet, what's your most valuable asset? They will say, my people. Guaranteed.
Yeah, sure, they say it.
But the point is, the challenge has been they've never been able to demonstrate really clearly that an investment in their people and treating their people better will unequivocally drive what the board is most interested in, which is stock market performance. And this last opportunity, after 28 years of
that's the handshake.
Driving,
that's bringing indeed, for you.
It brings it all back together. That's exactly right. And so that's my motivation at Irrational Capital. I'm excited. I'm back at the beginning, Ethan. We're building a new business. I love building businesses, and this business it makes sense. And if we do it right, it fits perfectly into my time at AN1 and my time at B-Lab, building businesses that put their people first, not because it's virtue signaling, but because it builds better businesses.
I shared with you before we hit the record button that having you on today was very selfishly, from my perspective, not only being able to share your insights with folks, but also somewhat the validation of my 16 years trying to take a different approach to coaching and consulting to get people out of the mindset of employees as an expense.
Yeah.
Or to label them as an asset, to get them to realize that their people are their only lasting competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And to have you share this kind of 28-year career makes me feel a little bit more comfortable that there are people like you who are kind of strategically planning out a future for those organizations who want to go there. So I just want to say thank you for coming on the show today. And just if anybody, Bart, says, I've heard everything he said, and I need to talk to him about how to reach out to Irrational Capital, how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, the best way is to use LinkedIn. I'm an active user of LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn, pretty straightforward. Just message me. I'd be happy to connect. And I'd also encourage you, like if there's something in this conversation that tickled in the back of your head, the idea that indeed this might just be true, I would encourage you to go to our website and grab the JP Morgan research reports. Again, you don't have to believe me, right? And I understand people who have been raised in the world of finance and think, understandably view this idea with some suspicion. Go read the JP Morgan reports. They are if not the most trusted, among the most trusted research houses on the planet. They've written 5 reports. Spend a little time with them. And hopefully, Ethan, you and I will continue to get some converts.
In addition to that, please everybody know that all of Bart's contact details, the relative links he alluded to, as well as the research reports, they'll be put in the description below the video. So Bart, thank you so much for coming on the program. I cannot tell you what a pleasure it was having you share your insights today.
My pleasure, Ethan. Thanks for all that you do, and I'm obviously honored to be with you today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.